Tips from Trestle is brought to you by Wiseox AI, the Dining with Dementia Workshop, and the 100% Leader. Welcome to Tips from Trestle, the Senior Living Food and Hospitality Podcast. This podcast explores the senior living industry with a unique focus on food, hospitality, and the community experience. I'm your host, Aaron Fish. My goal for this podcast, bringing the resident and customer experience to the front of mind in our industry. We should bring the passionate spirit of food and hospitality to everything that we do and everyone we serve each and every day. So what are we waiting for? Let's get to it.
Let's bring up our guest. Damon is the Senior Vice President, Operations at Providence Senior Living. And like I said, he is a veteran of the industry. Let's just dive in. We're going to talk Crisis Playbook. So, Damon, as we think about this, I want to really start with your definition of a crisis playbook. What does that mean to you? What does that mean to the senior living industry?
It's not like a playbook that you pull off a shelf or a policy like we do in most things. The crisis playbook's really about being disciplined in the way of thinking and leading under pressure. And crisis in senior living, they're never theoretical. They involve real people, our residents, our families, team members, and they always seem to include regulators, legal exposure, sometimes reputational risk. And because of that, it's the playbook is less about checklists and going by a book. It's more about doing the right thing in sequence, deciding in sequence. So for me, it starts with stabilizing your people first, ensuring that your residents are safe, supporting your staff and lowering our emotion in the room, usually. And then it comes to stabilizing the facts. What happened, what we know, as opposed to what we assume, and what still needs to be verified. Only then how to approach what you're about to do. And throughout it all, of course, documentation's key, that non-negotiable. We talk about that all the time in senior living. Because without the documentation, our memories fade, narratives shift. Regulators don't like working off of our good intentions, but they need to know where that documentation is. And so just as important, the crisis play is knowing what not to do. Don't speculate. Don't over-explain. Don't get your emotions involved. Don't try to fix things before you fully understand. The playbook itself, Aaron, isn't the typical playbook. It's really how you respond.
No, and that really tracks, right? Because when we first started talking about this, the idea of this conversation, the idea of a manual or some binder that you could go and pull off with yourself never even came up. It's exactly what you said. And so when you think about those frontline leaders, the executive directors or those regional directors that are dealing with this, a crisis is different than emergencies, right? Emergency preparedness, we've talked about that. We've had people on about that. And that's about, do we have our EMH documentations printed off and saved? But we're talking about other things on top of that. And so what are some of the crises that you've experienced or you have seen in your time in the industry that really get underestimated by leaders?
You said just a minute ago, as far as most senior leaders, we're really good at this point, especially in Florida, with our hurricanes, our power outages, our floods, our fire alarms. Those events, they all have checklists. They all have clear lines of responsibility. We practice them all the time, right? And ironically, those are usually the situations teams handle best. The crises that we have a tendency to underestimate are the human-driven ones because they don't announce themselves. They don't know, like with our hurricanes, we know they're coming, right? In most cases, we know our floods, especially in Florida. We know what's our weather folks. They keep us appraised. But when it comes to human-driven ones, they don't tell us that they're calling, and they start small. They feel manageable until they aren't, right? So family conflict is a big one. A concerned family member and a frustrated email, a late night complaint that can seem routine at first, but when those concerns aren't acknowledged, when they're not addressed promptly, when the tone becomes defensive, or et cetera, those can escalate really quickly. And I think that's something that's often underestimated. Staff behavior is often underestimated, right? A comment's made in frustration, a cut is taken, a busy shift, and inconsistent policy. Those are underestimated. Documentation gaps, those are often underestimated, right? You'll get to it later. Don't worry about that. I'll get to it, that type of thing. But if documentation isn't done clearly, timely, consistently, it will, as we would all say, it may as well not have happened in our eyes or eyes of the regulators and the attorneys. And leaders, they don't often realize they're exposed until they're asked to reconstruct those events weeks or months later. So those documentation gaps can often be underestimated. Or delayed escalation. What about those things, those items that you're going to get to later, or you're going to tell your communicate it up later? It's not good for those delayed responses. In senior living, time matters. I often talk about Lucille Ball and Lucille's friend there. You ever see that factory video when they're eating the chocolates?
Yep.
And it gets carried away. They put it in their mouth, whatever. You can't hit a stop button in senior living. And so a small issue escalated early was better managed. Escalated late, especially after emotions arise or narratives harden, they can be full blown problems. And so those are some of the things I think we often underestimate.
Wow. There are some that I've encountered in my career that I would have never even put two and two together, especially being in the food service realm, right? I had a culinary director at a community one time who was delivering meals and walked in to a resident apartment and found that the resident had committed suicide, right? And that's one of those things we never talk about, we never think about. But the layers of things that you have to deal with a situation like that, their employee and their traumatic experience, the family communication, other residents, the legal, the police, all of that. And that's not something that anybody had ever thought about or considered or done any training with. And for a culinary director, that's totally, you would think, outside the realm of what they do, but we have to be prepared for it. So
Mhm.
when you think of something like that, what's the very first thing that a leader should approach or think about or do when crises like what we've just discussed hit our community?
So I've said this isn't the first podcast that I've done where I've said this. So at this point, I think it's even in a magazine at this point recently. It's slow down before you speed up. Okay. Too many leaders, they jump right into it. They start fixing, they start explaining, they start defending. The first move they should be doing is contain the situation, really get your arms around it, protect your residents, preserve your facts, prevent the situation from getting any further out of hand. And so that means slowing down before you speed up, limit unnecessary communication, create space to think clearly, really calm down. And a calm leader sets the tone for the entire response. If you don't slow down and you don't really think about what's going on, the damage can be pretty significant.
Yeah, I love that because I, early in my career, was very much a especially in food service, like jump in, fix it, hands on, get it done, move on to the next thing. But a crisis, like some of the things we discussed, you gotta really process through it. When you think about how you use time and manage time and think about time, I think that's such a great point for leaders to take away. One of the things that I think sometimes can be missed in leadership in general, but I think especially in a situation where stress levels are increased, the crises, it feels like things are spinning out of control. We have to still balance the empathy needed in the situation, authority, and direction we have to give. And so we think about doing that. How do you balance those? Especially in a situation where you have to work with and deal with the family and a potential public lashback or blowback on what could come from that.
Yeah. So I learned this a long time ago, and I would encourage everyone, if you don't know this acronym, to write it down, because even in the toughest moments in my career, I think about it often. So the acronym is HEAT. H is hear 'em out. E is empathize. E is apologize. And T is take action. And I always think about that whenever I'm dealing with a tough situation, because again, the first one is hear them out. That your residents, your families, your team members, whatever it is, they need to be heard out. But the second one is what you mentioned earlier, that people don't understand very well, is empathy doesn't mean that you have to agree. And that distinction is very critical in senior living, right? You can, you can fully acknowledge a family's fear. You can fully acknowledge their frustration, their grief, but you don't have to validate conclusions or the accusations that may be coming at you, because they may not be accurate. You've got to, again, slow down, take the time to figure it all out. But families want to feel heard before they want solutions. And leaders have to honor that without surrendering clarity or control. That doesn't happen that often. We also got to figure out or think about, avoid the urge to over-explain in the moment, especially when emotions are high. We want to over-explain, and sometimes you come across as defensive. You can lock into incomplete facts, and unintentionally, you're escalating the situation. So it's not authority's not being about it's not being about cold or or measured or intentional. They just want to be heard, and they want you to know that you understand. And so my rule is pretty simple: listen fully, respond narrowly, and document immediately. And it all comes back down to that acronym I talked about earlier: HEAT. Hear them out, empathize, apologize, and take action. So when families see that you're calm, when they see that you're respectful and consistent, trust then tends to follow, even when the answer isn't what they hope for.
Yeah, I love that because the framework very much falls in line with a lot of the things I do when I talk about customer service recovery. And when we talk about that, that's, oh, we overcooked the chicken, we need to apologize, or we service was delayed, or some small thing happened. You having a framework like that where you have heat kind of fits right into what you're saying about slowing down. Because what I take away from you saying slow down doesn't mean take forever to do it. It just means to be like methodical and
Intentional.
intentional. Yeah. And your process of using the heat, it made me think, we should tell your team they need to lower the heat, or use that as both your training model of solving and addressing these crises effectively. I just love the way you framed that. And risk is obviously going to be a part of any crisis, right? Using my example of finding a resident who's committed suicide, there's a lot that goes into that, right? There is the death, there has to be an investigation, there's all these things that go with something like that. So where have you seen leaders that you worked with through some of these instances? Where do they most often create risk in how they handle themselves during a crisis?
A lot of them, I'm sure a lot of y'all have seen this, they talk too much. So a lot of leaders, they have good intentions, but they create risk by talking too much, too soon, too many people, early stage of the crisis, not really understanding the issue at hand. So things are still forming. Emotions are high, and sometimes that informal communication can really get out of control. So a casual comment in an email, a text, a hallway, that's never good. And so they really need to, again, slow down. The other thing that leaders often do that create risk for themselves is the digital communication. They respond too quickly or too informally in emails or in text messages. We got to take some. Everyone needs to remember that that information is permanent, that's discoverable, and it often can be misinterpreted, as we all know how emails can. And then something I talked about earlier is skipping that internal documentation because we're too busy, or I'll get to it later because they feel too overwhelmed. But clear, timely, factual notes protect the organization. They support everything you're going to try to do with the regulatory folks, regulatory compliance when they come in, and to ensure that your decisions can be explained accurately. We've got to take that time for good documentation. So strong leaders discipline themselves to slow, like I said, slow the communication, tighten our language, and document consistently. And by doing that, they'll be much better, and they'll be controlling that. They'll mitigate that risk as opposed to making the problem worse.
How should leaders think about regulators during a crisis?
They, as a partner, I think a lot of times we get nervous in our communities when the state shows up. We're lucky, Aaron, as being on with the association, we see Kim on a regular basis now, and Secretary Harris, and it's one of the benefits of the association. But the regulators, they respond to order, transparency, but they don't respond to panic. So in a crisis, they want to know that you're competent. They want to know that you're credible. They want to know that you're responding to them quickly, composed, organized, factual, all of that they want to see. They're not looking for perfection. And I think sometimes a lot of us, oh, we got to get it this way. We got to get it just right. They're not looking for home runs. They understand that. They're looking for evidence that risks are understood, that residents are protected, that our corrective actions are underway, clear timelines, like we talked about ad nauseum at this point, accurate documentation, consistent messaging. That's what they need to know. They need to know that you're in control. Chaos, on the other hand, invites deeper scrutiny, follow-up questions. And when you think about leaders, you want to think about structure, credibility, and control. And by showing that and demonstrating that, what you're going to have with your regulators is you'll have a partnership. And I think we're seeing that more and more again, thanks to Kim Smoke and Secretary Harris and the association. I hope that answers your question, Aaron. It's really a partnership and controlling the situation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that you're dead on. I know that everybody I've ever worked with, it always feels like there's a panic. Oh no, the state's here. Oh no, the local health department's here for a kitchen inspection. Just work with them. That's the best thing you can do.
Absolutely.
One constituent that we mentioned early on, but we haven't really talked about yet is your staff, right? And so how do you approach preventing that fear or the gossip, right? That you mentioned the conversations in the hallway. How do you keep all of that from making the situation worse?
Yeah. It's funny, right? Because we deal with a lot of our folks, CNAs or med techs. It always seems there be some level of drama in our communities. And so whenever there is a situation to control that, to gossip, so that we're not making the situation worse. It's real important that you, if anyone knows me, is one thing that I've never been accused of, and that's under communication. In my opinion, silence creates rumors, and oversharing creates liability. So in a crisis situation, we really need to control that communication, clear direction, and consistent messaging. And that usually controls that fear or gossip. With regulators, like we talked earlier, that means sharing verified facts, documented actions, define next steps. So no speculation in the hallways, no casual language, no emotional explanations. That doesn't help us. So it's that. So as far as the staff fear, gossip, and how to control it, it's all about controlled communication. It's all about being very intentional in what you're doing and how you're responding, and communicating with purpose, discipline, and basically creating confidence so that they know that you've got the situation well in hand, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, it's so important because the staff is a key part of how all the communication and how the process is going to unfold. And I think what you're laying out for us, you make perfect sense. But as we close out here, our conversation, what do you want people who are listening to this conversation to take away when it comes to crisis playbooks and crisis management?
I think I just hope everyone walks away understand that, and we've all heard this before, right? But crises don't define leaders, but the responses to the crisis is what defines us, right? So every leader, especially in senior living, I say it a lot, we don't get paid for the happy days necessarily, right? We get paid for how we face those difficult moments. And so what separates strong leadership is the ability to slow down, stay present, and respond with attention, like we were talking about earlier. That's the main thing I want people to take away from. And also that learn from the bad. So too many times I think people are like, oh, this is a bad situation. Oh, I want to run away from it. Don't run away from it. Run to it. Because then when you have another situation in your community, because they're in these grays, they came for 30 years of senior living experience. And not, like we talked about, not everything's a good day, but it's how we respond and how we respond and how we learn from those situations. My first introduction to the state of Florida was a rape case with one of my caregivers. Oh, it doesn't matter what organization or what building, and a resident. And that's how I got introduced to the state of Florida. And after that, I've had gang members. I remember, and this doesn't matter what part of Florida, and this wasn't recently, but when gang members were running across the lawn of one of my communities and we had to go into a lockdown, I too, unfortunately, had a suicide, Aaron. I had a drowning, fires, hurricanes, everything. The other thing I want everyone to take away is, although those are horrible experiences, learn from it, because when the next thing comes around, you can handle it that much easier. It's tough times over my career, but each time something comes at me, quite frankly, it gets easier because there's not a lot at this stage of the game that I haven't already experienced, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. So I hope that answers that question.
Absolutely. There's an unlimited number of crises that can occur in a community. And like you said, learning and evolving and be prepared as best as possible always is going to be the best tool. So, Damon, thank you for joining us. Thank you for talking through the crisis playbook philosophy that you have and how you handle crises. And I appreciate you here joining us today.
Thanks for having me, as always.
So there it is, everybody. Another one in the books. Thanks again for tuning in. Please follow and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on social media at Tips from Trestle. You can also learn more about the work I do by following me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. And be sure to check out Trestle Hospitality Concepts at www.trestlehospitalityconcepts.com. I'm your host, Aaron Fish, and this has been another episode of Tips from Trestle.